Thanks for being on the Gnostic Warrior today, Carl. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you, and thanks for having me. It's a very beautiful spring evening here in Stockholm, so I'm very happy today.
Yeah, we are blessed to talk from so far away in this year 2019, and we were having some difficulties with our connection and video, and those good old technical difficulties. So I appreciate your patience. and
Yeah, I'm well aware of those, and it's everything seems very good in theory, and all these gadgets and gizmos and technical platforms, but sometimes there's a long, stretch between theory and practice. So I'm
Definitely.
tolerant.
Definitely, and you've been around the block as regards to podcasts, so I'm sure
Yeah,
you're familiar with this. So, hey, Carl,
absolutely.
this is the first time that I've spoken to you. I do have your great book here, Occulture: The Unseen Forces That Drive Culture Forward. And as I had mentioned to you before we started the podcast, this is one of my top 20 books, and I mean that. And I read a tremendous amount of books, and this really puts it together, for me personally, as far as the occult and unseen forces and magic and so forth. But, before we get into the great work you're doing now, because you've done a lot since then, you're doing
Yeah.
movies and everything. But can you tell us a little bit about who you are, your path, even as a youngster to who you are now, and
Yeah.
be as long-winded as you'd like, Carl.
Yeah, yeah, no, of course it's a long period of time that I've been active, but it's also remarkable when I think back. I guess that's kind of normal when you think back that, whoa, I did that thing 30 years ago or 35 years ago. Uh, it's a long stretch of time, but it doesn't really feel like that. So I've been active since basically the mid 1980s in various subcultural and occultural things. It the output sort of began with me making a fanzine called Lollipop, and it was all about rock and roll and sleaze and B movies and the kind of trash culture that I still love. And then I drifted more and more into the occult, but it was through pop culture, and at the same time, I was also actively seeking out things and trying things out, mainly via this magical order slash occultural network called the Temple of Psychic Youth with Genesis Peorage, and that was a mind opener, an eye opener, an opener of many things, and one of the most interesting things with that wasn't like the magical techniques per se. It was that they or we had a different approach to what magic is. And for instance, one key element in this was the networking, the sharing of information. Of course, this was pre-internet, so you had to, let people know via letters and newsletters and things like that what you were after, and then people would provide, and that would go, both ways. So it was an interesting exchange of information that really, I think, programmed me in a good way. Because when I think back, like 30 years ago, today I'm still doing the same thing. Basically, I have more experience, I have more means, I have more tools, in a way, but the approach and the attitude is basically the same. Anyway, that kind of open-minded occultural imprint took me on various magical journeys as well, being involved with the Church of Satan, being involved with the OTO, and some other things too. And they have all added to my, bouquet, in a way, bouquet of occult experience, or magical experience, I should say. And at the same time that I've taken in so much via travels and meetings and networking, I've also churned and filtered and gone through the things that I've learned, sort of processed. And I think what happened during these past 10 years is that I've felt a strong urge to give something back, and not specifically for altruistic reasons, although that's a good side effect, but mainly because I think my vessel was filled to the brim with stuff, magical stuff. So Occulture, for instance, is an example of that. It's lectures and essays that I've written about topics that have interested me over the years, and when I put them together like in book form, it becomes much more cohesive in a way. And also something that you and I talked about before is that there's a red thread in all of these things, even though the pieces stem from different years or different eras. And I guess that's one way of summing up myself, is that I've been myself all throughout the decades, but the path, you could say that it's been the same, but it has had some, winding and some uphill things and some downhill things, but at the same time, that's just how life is. But I see myself as being the same person basically that I was when I started looking at these things. However, I think I've done a very good thing, and that's that I've always trusted my intuition, and I've stuck to the trusting my intuition and staying true to what makes me tick, what makes me find life, not bearable, but interesting, really interesting. And those things are now so integrated in my life in terms of, writing, making films, making music, all these creative efforts. They are now such a huge part of my everyday life. And that wouldn't have been the case had I, discarded them or downsized them early on. So in that sense, I'm a happy camper who's proud of not having, haven't compromised too much. And although at times it's been kind of, difficult, it makes sense now, and I'm very happy about where I am today.
I find it interesting, Carl, that, many of us who get involved in the occult and, especially in our later years, a lot of us were involved in the 80s and the 70s kind of scene, and that seemed to carry on from the 60s as well. I had alcoholic parents. I was drawn from my home. I really didn't have a teacher or anything, so I kind of went to the streets and I got drawn to kind of punk rock and that kind of scene. And if I think about it, I was kind of just going with my own intuition, and I didn't really have a lot of wisdom, but I was being drawn towards this dark kind of atmosphere and exciting. I was young, and it was just like, nothing was going good at home. My dad wasn't, that great. He was a good provider, but, as far as wisdom goes, that there was none. He was just a complete drunk, when he had got home, just a functioning alcoholic. I love the man. He's no longer with us, but I had to kind of figure things out on my own. And I find this common thread with us that are now involved in the occult. A lot of us were in this kind of shady different scenes, whether it was me with hardcore punk rock and we were doing the fanzine things and the political activism. And I got kind of turned on to this, and that's really what woke me up to kind of the occulture and the system, where I didn't know about it. And I was like, yeah, that's what's wrong with my house, and that's what's wrong with this world. And I could relate to it. And I found a lot of knowledge and wisdom in the punk rock scene, where a lot of people wouldn't think you would find that. So my question is, what do you think draws us to these shady areas? You were involved a little bit, I mean, in Satanism. I think you still are now, the OTO. And did you have a similar upbringing to me, or did you have a great upbringing and you just decided to go this route?
Yeah, I don't think there are any great upbringings, actually. It's just variations on weird things. But my upbringing was very orderly in a way, not that much. I felt understimulated, and I think that my being an only child, and given a lot of space and time for myself, and I preferred that. And I felt very understimulated at school. Always felt that I had to wait for the other kids and things like that. And I think that created a kind of an escapistic imprint, a kind of daydreaming function for survival in a way that has been very helpful for me, not only in terms of the creative stuff, but also in terms of the magical stuff. Because I think that like visualization and allowing yourself to drift off and things like that are very, very important factors. I wouldn't say that they're like exclusively important, but for me they have been very, very important. So I can see that it hasn't so much been avoiding lack of stimulation or chaos. It's been more a feeling of what on earth are these people doing, and feeling a bit bored, actually. And then what happened then was I was a little bit too young when the first wave of punk happened. I was born in 1966. So I would say that I came to like a musical awakening around 79 when I was 13. So I sort of missed the first wave. I read about it, but I couldn't really understand it. But when it triggered me, that was a great boost too. Not specifically punk per se, but the entire environment of do it yourself. That was a key magical factor in my life, and I guess it still is, although hopefully on a higher level. This thing where you don't compromise, you cut and paste, you make your little fanzine, or save up money and press your little single, and there was a great energy that I think was worldwide, or at least permeating the Western world and youth at the time. That still, I think that's been instigator of many, many things, including technological developments and people who are in their like me, in their 50s, all experienced that kind of wave of everything is possible. You just have to do it in a way. So I think that it was an energizing environment that could not really be controlled by corporate interests. And that's also very interesting, because when they try to market and sell something that has vital energy, then it usually dwindles. But this energy has sort of just moved on, taken on a new form and reshaped itself. And I can see it still existing.
Yeah,
and I think the reason why it was so energetic.
Yeah, and I wanted just to touch on that, Carl, and sorry to interrupt, because that really sparked some thoughts to me. So, we have this DIY culture, and we talk about it, in past reference to the punk rock scene and the different occult scenes and so forth. And, the corporatocracy, the powers that be, have always tried to get into it and control and package it, but they never really could do that, right? And so now we're seeing that with our current scene on the internet, right? With media, popular podcast, people that are very popular and independent, they're trying to shut down, and these people are almost like unstoppable, these energies, these forces. And that's what I often see, Carl, with all these great people that have went before, whether it be in the magical sphere of the occult, whether it be in the philosophical side of it. There's these forces that are just bigger than life that seem to inhabit these people, and they seem to be conduits. And they realize it almost. And the powers that be have always tried to stop these conduits, but I see these forces gaining now with the internet. Even though we're having this, information overload, I'm seeing some forces and some different lines that are really getting stronger as they try to put the restraints down on them.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that it's very interesting that in this major development of the possibility of disseminating information freely, which is of course essential and a very, very good thing, and at this point in time absolutely necessary for survival. I think, this immediate sharing of vital pieces of information. At the same time, though, this is always that's an analogy or a symbol that I use in the Occulture book, for instance, this thing where this pendulum is swinging, and the more it swings one side, it will swing equally much to the other side, because that's how it works. This thing with disinformation or misinformation popping up, and you have these sort of things that are, almost ironically called trolls, the trolling. It, of course, is tied in with the upsurge of freedom or potential freedom. Then there will be forces trying to counteract that, and I don't even think that it's all conscious. It's just some forces are restrictive, they're draconian, they're dark in a way, in a true way, and it just seems that there can never be one force rolling ahead, full steam ahead, without there being a counterforce. And I don't know whether that's, thermodynamics or physics, or whether it's just something, psychosocial in human beings. But it's interesting to see how extreme the times that we're living in actually are, because the pendulum seems to be moving so rapidly that we can't even see it anymore. After McCarthyism in the 50s, and the people who were so afraid of supposed communism, and that then led into a more liberated 1960s, fueled by drugs and rock and roll and what have you, and then back to financial restriction. It's almost like there has never been a consecutive movement of good things. Or we should also be happy, when we realize, nor has there been one of negative things.
Sure.
When things become too draconian and too cruel or too brutal, the good forces will put an end to it. And whether those interests are, whether those, incentives are for financial reasons or philosophical reasons, that's kind of besides the point, because everybody needs a trigger of some kind.
Yeah.
But it's just, I believe in the swinging of the pendulum, and probably the most difficult time to discern what's actually happening is right now. It's such a confused time.
Yeah, and let's talk about those forces, because sometimes I think people get confused, because I know you use that in a general sense to, I believe, represent a energy or a type of force that's not really representative 100%, say, of the archons, the powers that be, the people that rule over us, but this is a force that permeates a culture, and sometimes a specific group of people that are working under one force, possibly unknowingly doing things under this force, and another group working on the other. And what I wanted to relate this and pick your brain, Carl, because I have you here, is the Gnostics back in ancient times. They kind of made it simple, right? Their two axioms were know thyself and nothing in excess, right?
Yeah.
So know thyself, nothing in excess. You could pretty much apply that to anything. And then they divided humanity into two parts, okay, that were controlled by two spirits. One would be the counterfeit spirit, that causes man to sin and causes, what the Christians would say to sin and do things of evil to their neighbor and whatever. And then the one would be what the Christians would call the holy fire, the Holy Spirit, right? The good spirit, the good daemon. This would be the ones that work towards the light and towards knowledge and towards, having a better world, that we all could live in. A more altruistic kind of view. It doesn't mean that, they don't do business or do things that are selfish and they're not perfect, but they're more working towards the light and in knowledge, where the other guys are looking to crush the free speech. They're looking to, instead of contribute, they copy people. They you know what I mean? They are not original. Yeah. They're not authentic. And then they attack those people like ourselves, as opposed. So the forces, when you talk like that, I feel in the Gnostic sense that there's ones that are on the dark side and some that are on the light side. And that's kind of the way I look at it. And when they say what was controlling these forces, they talked about this spirit that was within these people. And so that's kind of where my research has went, is that these people are controlled by a force that's within them. And this force is a parasitic force that causes these people to do things for this parasitic entity, this energy. That's kind of where I'm at. And where I related this to is, where eventually the Christians took over the Gnostics, right, with the Catholic Church and everything, is they say the devil controls this world. And you hear, Pope Francis, again, I know this isn't a Christian type of thing, but I want to kind of go full circle here, is that now we have, I believe, the rise of the Gnostics, okay? The online, the knowledge, the power. Hey, this is what's going on. This is what's going on with the, say the vaccinations and all this truth. And then you have these other forces kind of battling them at the same time and trying to squash the free speech. So these Gnostics, these people spreading the knowledge, can't do it no more. It's kind of, I feel like we're coming full circle to 2,000 years ago when the church ended up crushing the Gnostics and they put in an orthodox type of teaching. So kind of that's what I feel we're seeing now, but more of a technological type of thing. And then you hear, again, and I'm relating this to, Pope Francis, he's in charge of, 1 billion Catholics, right? He's saying one of the biggest sins is Gnosticism. And, we're talking about this, again, 2,000 years later. So it's just real ironic. And then I'm seeing, people like Jordan Peterson, his book get taken off of Amazon, and in New Zealand it's banned just for telling people how to live right. So that's where I'm seeing kind of the pendulum go. And, in regards to the forces, I believe that this is a parasitic force that controls the earth. That's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting. But also, I think that all of these phenomena in individuals and in communities can all be described with different terminologies, and I think that it can be revealing to use a religious terminology, like you did in a way, but it can also be sometimes better, more revealing to use a different one. Say, for instance, a psychological one. And what I mean is that if what you call this parasitic thing, that could easily be translated to, anxiety and the fear of becoming fully individuated. And what people who fear that, meaning fear being true to themselves, fear being, honest about, sexuality and how they are simply functioning in what you really, really think. If you're not honest in those things, you will be thwarted in this individuation process. And what happens then is that you seek solace, you seek security and comfort in groups of people instead of inside yourself. And here comes the main problem. There are so many people who feel great things, they reveal great things, they discover great things, have epiphanies often in youth, etc. But they then retract to so-called normality and the safety in numbers, etc. And if you have someone who is truly, let's call it enlightened, that can be both philosophically or religiously tainted in a way, but someone who has an epiphany and realizes, wow, this is what I want to do with my life. And then they are stuck in a community where someone says, no, that's not correct, it's actually immoral, without explaining what immoral means. Then you have a conflict that is basically the many versus the few. And I'm not saying that everybody who's on the few side or on the individualistic side is, by default a good person. That's not true. But in these cases, and let's stick with your Gnostic environment, the deal was, as you Americans say, the deal was that the individual finds his or her own direct communication with God. And that would be enough for someone to lead a decent life, a correct life, a righteous life, etc., etc. What happened with Christianity was simply the anity. They became a movement. And when you have a movement, and a movement can be basically anything more than one individual. When you have a group of two people or more, there's always a power struggle, because that's how human beings are functioning. And the more one cluster gains power, the more power it will devour and demand. And that's why you have these super clusters of basically monotheistic religions, feeding off of its constituents in a way. And they've been doing it for a long, long, long time. And why should one trust someone who says, you should listen to me because I know what God is, for instance. You should lead your life like this, and you should pay this much in taxes, etc., etc., when the person in question feels that, no, this is not what I feel. And of course, I'm not saying that everybody who is involved in being good Christians or good Jews or good Muslims, that they are wrong, as whatever floats the boat, etc. But when you go in a discrepant way against what you feel is the right thing, then you're doing not only yourself a disservice, you're doing humanity a disservice, because progress has only been made by individuals who've dared to take the leap and confront the conformity of the herd. And I know this sounds like a very Nietzschean thing, but that's basically where I've always been at. And I believe that the individual has to defy the herd. The individual has to defy the collective, and especially if that collective is trying to impose not just moral, but moralistic rules that will go against what's good for the individual, and it's not surprising that those moral, chains and fetters, they always have to do with sexual things.
Yeah, definitely.
They always have to do with important life choice, existential things, and that's not a random thing. It's a well constructed. Power structure that basically needs to feed itself more power. It's lost touch with any kind of spirituality. It's lost touch with any kind of ingenuity or creativity or just anything that's revealing. It's just a structure. And that's one of the main reasons why we are in such deep muck today, is because those structures have gone haywire. They should be questioned.
Yeah, Carl, and I want to specify that, I've had many friends on different sides of the fence, whether they be in Satanism, whether they be, a Freemason, a Gnostic, or whether they be a Christian or a Muslim and so forth. And I've met good and bad people in every sect, whether
absolutely.
Christian, and to be honest with you, I've known a lot more, I would say, bad and evil Christians than I've met evil Satanists. Okay, and
you're right.
And I mean that with all due respect here. And I'm not a Satanist myself. I consider myself a Gnostic. I grew up, Roman Catholic and so forth. But I'm very familiar with Satanism. I've read several books on it. You are definitely more an expert than me. You've been around the block since the 70s and the 80s. But explain. I've met a lot of Satanists that have a lot of, I would say, if you were a Christian and you were to talk to, they have a lot of the morals, meaning that they do have morals and they treat people how, say, they want to be treated for the most part. Where they differ is like the individuation is, you're not going to tell me what to do. I'm going to, as far as the sexual, whether they are heterosexual or homosexual, whatever, they are definitely liberal in their views as far as that goes. So you see I see a blend, and then there's, of course, the fringe, which I would say is the fringe you find in any type of religion or sect, whether that be Satanism or whether that be Christianity or whether that be extreme Muslims and so forth. So explain that. how to people out there that might be, say, a Christian and they're going, oh my God, this guy's a Satanist, or someone that doesn't really understand it, how you can be a good person still and still be a Satanist and do what the hell you want?
Yeah. No, of course you can. I mean, first of all, these terms and these structures, sort of rebellious structures or whatever you want to call them, they are only symbols too. It's just like every group has their own symbol. Every group has their own set of keys that will unlock the so-called mysteries to them. And I think that in this case, you have to look at, what's the message here. If you discard the scandalous symbols and look at the message, and then of course you see a message that is sort of pro-individualistic, and it's also very tolerant. The only amount of intolerance comes into account when people are being intolerant towards them. But on the whole, people who are individuated automatically get a great respect for other people who are on their path, whether they are fully individuated or whether they're just trying hard. And what I mean is that I think people are better off if they look, beyond the symbols, beyond the structures. I'm not pushing this, or I'm not selling this. I'm interested in many things, but it's interesting to see that there are certain symbols that are still very controversial, and I would say specifically in the US, and that's another topic. But I think one of the reasons why Anton LaVey, when he codified Satanism in the Satanic Bible and in the Church of Satan, he did that for the sake of getting publicity and becoming well known and spreading these ideas, which could, of course, they could be, expressed in a different way, expressed in a different terminology. It would still carry the same message, but it wouldn't be as controversial. So in that sense, yes, that kind of Satanism was created with the big S word to have an impact, and it certainly did. But when you scratch the surface and maybe rub out the symbols, you see a philosophy that's very Nietzschean in the best possible sense. It's life enhancing, life affirming. It has to do with a kind of direct, this thing you call lex talionis. It's like the rule of natural law in a way. And there's none of the monotheistic celebration of the meekness, for instance. However, I would say that it's, it has strong Gnostic elements. And although some people would argue, no, it's a materialistic philosophy, etc., that's true also. But if people involved in that feel that they have a need to explore themselves in the inner spheres and stuff like that, that will be without influence by some other person, will be without the influence of some other structure. That means that it's Gnostic by definition. So there is a kinship there. In the rebelliousness and the discarding of structures, you can be respectful to others who've gone on similar paths and have stuff to relay and talk about. But you can never trust anyone else to the point where you blot out your own curiosity, because that's not a good thing. So what I'm saying is basically there are many things that people will find, scandalous or upsetting, but that tells more of where they are coming from. So if they've grown up in a very, very very Christian environment, they will find that terrifying that some people call themselves Satanists or the symbol of Satan. But you have to take into account that that's where the symbol originated. It originated in some pretty weird, church fathers' hallucinations about these things, and that has, all throughout the centuries become, if not a fact, then at least a truth for many of these people. And that's the complexity of it, is that you can't really rub out all the symbols because then people wouldn't be attracted to anything. If you have something to convey, you have to have a kind of a structure and a message that's clothed in a language that will attract people. And the people who were attracted to, for instance, the Church of Satan in the 1960s were people who were sort of in between. They were against the squares, or sort of the middle class morals that were deeply influenced by Judeo-Christian value systems, but they were also against the hippies and these sort of free-floating, drug explosion and experimentation. So they were stern on one hand, but they were also super and experimenting in their own way. So they were sort of in between. And of course, people on both sides, those extremes, disliked what they were doing, but no one can deny that there was some pretty interesting things going on there. And right now I'm working on a documentary film about Anton LaVey, and it's very interesting then to think about these things. And one of the same question I've asked all these people I've interviewed is that, would it have been a different thing hadn't LaVey used the word Satan, for instance? And there are many different, responses to that. But the main consensus seems to have been that hadn't he used that strong symbol, the movement itself and the teaching would not have been disseminated as much as it now has.
You knew Anton LaVey personally?
Yeah. We met him in 1989. And then we met sort of every other year up until 93. And, stayed in touch after that also until he died in 97.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with him and how he was as a person?
Absolutely. He was very, of course, intelligent, and he was also very curious, and he lived according to, the tenets of his philosophy, meaning he indulged in the things that made him tick, the things that he liked to do. And at this period in time when I got to meet him, that was sort of in his autumn years, and he was kind of reclusive in a way, or basically, I should say, selective. And he liked to spend his time doing things that he liked to do without too much social interaction. So I saw a side of him that was loved to watch movies. We watched movies together, and he always liked to entertain, to play music. He was a very, very good musician and an entertaining musician. So our paths sort of connected, not so much via the occult stuff, even though that was there also, but it was my youthful fascination with American B-movies and film noir and a certain kind of American culture that probably made him, think that, who's this weird guy from Europe? Why does he know so many things about things that I know? That I'm an old American man, So sure. It was kind of an appreciation of a certain kind of culture that was, I think, the glue or the door opener, so it was great. It just he really enjoyed life, and also consciously so. Many people can enjoy life, but he was aware of what he liked, and he saw to it that he indulged in those things, and that was a great, magical lesson.
Sure, and do you believe that him becoming somewhat reclusive towards the end of his life was just him being more real and keeping those people that were close to him in his inner sphere, and kind of everybody else that was maybe just kind of, the groupies away, and it was just those tight circle? That's what he kind of did in the end?
Yeah.
Sure.
I think so. And also I think it has to do with life, basically. As you grow older, even though some people say that you have the same kind of energy in your life, it certainly seems to be the way that more and more energy goes to maintenance rather than frolicking.
Sure.
So I think that age was one thing, and towards the end he wasn't really feeling that well either, and that makes you want to conserve the energy that you have. So to be wild and exploratory and have a large, active, extroverted social life might not be the best thing. So I think it was just like enjoying the time that he had in the best possible way. And I think you could ask any person of 60 and above what they feel, and I'm sure many of them agree. That it's better to conserve the energy.
Sure. Would you consider Anton LaVey, the best conduit for these teachings, these knowledge for the satanic, the institutionalization of this religion? Or was he just a clever man and a genius marketer?
Yeah, I think the both,
Okay.
but more emphasis on the first question. I think absolutely. I mean, you can never discount the person who took time to, write the material, to codify the philosophy. He walked the talk for sure. And at the same time, he was a clever marketer, and that was one of the main things that he wanted to achieve. He wanted to make it a career. He wanted to make it a successful, operation. But that was never like the main thing. And my experience, both of him in real life, so to speak, and also in my own studies, what he wrote and what other people wrote of him, is that again, it's a life. People shift through different phases of life, but I think the success is also indicative that it still holds. It keeps up a relevance for new generations of people who can still relate. There's nothing, really archaic or dusty about LaVey's occultism in a way, but at the same time, it's not, bland enough to pass for some kind of, mass market self-help book. It's an efficient thing. There is magic there. There is, ritual, and there's a kind of I wouldn't say belief system, but there's a structure there that allows for very creative ritual mind frames. So it's kind of in between again. It's he positioned this thing, the Church of Satan and the philosophy, in between the archaic, usually very conservative and prejudiced environment, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's these sort of moralistic people who can never touch anything that has the S word. But that's them missing out. It's almost like the S word is what used to be called a bullshit detector. When people don't want to go past the symbol, then that you can never have an interesting conversation with those people.
Definitely, and it never scared me. I grew up, as I had mentioned, on the street in punk rock,
Yeah.
and I've studied everything. And as I had mentioned, I've had friends on both sides of the fence. But what about those people? I think it's important, Carl, that you address the people on the fringe that maybe take these teachings and they go and they do something maybe atrocious, or they're caught killing something or sacrificing something. And it does happen.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not talking about a satanic panic, but when I've researched Satanism on both sides of the fence, I've seen the good, and I've talked to people such as yourself, and then also I see these crazy people on the fringe. What about these people? What's happening with them? Are they just like any other person? I would say 99% of the killings in this country, 50% are probably not of a religion, and then 50% are Christian, right? They grew up Christian.
Yeah.
So killing someone is not something that's just involved in Satanism, but it does happen,
No.
and they do claim that they sacrifice to Satan and so forth. So.
Yeah. The thing is that again, I think a psychological rather than a cultic or an occult or a religious interpretation model needs to be applied. These are usually people who would commit crimes anyway in any system that they are drawn into.
Sure.
And that's the problem with cultic psychology, is that people who are who have and nurture cults, they pick people who are absolutely non-individuated and who are so like fuzzy around the edges that you can basically throw anything into their mouth and they will swallow without chewing. and that can lead to, if it's also an abusive environment, lead to that these people do very bad things. But it's because they're weak. It's not because of any philosophy itself that they are involved with, because any philosophy that does not promote individuation, a free individuality, and experimentation in a way that is good and healthy for the individual, that's just bad. And the people doing criminal things exist in all of these large religions or small groups or whatever. It has to do with personal weakness and not with any philosophy that's promoted.
Amen to that, Carl. I agree 100%. So
Yeah.
I wanted you to address that, and it is something that I found in my extensive research, because I'm doing some podcasts, and I plan to do a movie and a book called The Cult of Demons, and it's people that have claimed to be possessed by a demon or to worship Satan and so forth. And every single one of them either has a mental issue, right, or a health issue.
Yeah.
And a lot of them have these issues, and then they get involved, or they get involved with someone that also has an issue but might be a little mentally superior to them, and they start mind controlling them, and then this is involved with it, and of course someone that's has not researched these symbols, they're weak mentally and so forth, they're easily kind of swept away,
Totally. And that's what I said before. That there's always danger ahead when there's more than one person involved.
Sure, definitely. Yeah, I actually was interviewing Dr. Chestnut yesterday on the cult of Santa Muerte in Mexico, and that's a unique one. But it's interesting that these different cults pop up. Have you heard of the cult of Santa Muerte?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, it'll be a new podcast coming out shortly, but it's going to be great. And let's talk about some of your new work, Carl. While we got a little time left here.
Yeah.
You just released a new movie called CineMagician.
That's right.
Tell us about that movie.
Yeah, it's another of those almost like full circle movements in my life that comes to fruition after a long time, and it's not because I'm slow. I think just things have to mature, and I'm you don't work with one thing for 30 years. Things come and go, and then they pop up again. But basically, I was totally fascinated. I would say maybe even obsessed with Kenneth Anger, who is an American movie director and also an Aleister Crowley admirer. And when I was sort of blooming in my teens, I loved, and of course I was, as everybody else, fascinated by Crowley. And to have these two things merge in these beautiful films made by this interesting filmmaker made me want to write about that. And I had a thesis at Stockholm University about Aleister Crowley's influence in Kenneth Anger's films. And to cut a long story short, that got me to Anger in 1989. And that was, of course, quite a trip, fascinating. And over the years, later decades, we kept in touch. And when we met, I usually made like a new interview for some newspaper or magazine. And that just kept on going. And then it came to the point where in 2008, I was asked by the Danish Film School to be the interviewer when he was, there for a Q&A for the students there. And that led to yet another great conversation. And I thought, I really need to get some of this stuff on video. So I started shooting some interviews on video. And that's basically what I put together, not as a traditional documentary, like about Kenneth Anger, like a biopic. It's more like him and me talking. That's why it's called CineMagician Conversations with Kenneth Anger. And the good thing is that I've seen some other films, and I've had people met people who've had experiences of him as a grumpy old man and stuff like that. But I seem to have gotten good things out of him. He is. He's been willing to talk about Crowley, for instance. That's not always the case, and about his life and his, things that have happened, and all the process behind his best-selling Hollywood Babylon books. And it's just a fun film for for people who know Anger, but also a great introduction to Anger for people who don't know him. So I'm very happy about that film.
Yeah, and if can you give the audience a quick introduction to who he was and what he did and why he was
Yeah, no,
famous?
he's still alive. So basically, already in the 1940s, he started making these own very poetic, personal, experimental films. And at this time, it was cumbersome. There was 16 millimeter as opposed to the bigger, more bulky and expensive 35 millimeter film. So 16 allowed you to do things on your own. Basically, it's just like shooting a film on your phone today, for instance. But he worked really hard and with very small means to create these very personal films. And they dealt with sexual things, they dealt with magical things, and they're just amazing. So if you haven't seen any Kenneth Anger films, I strongly recommend it for the sake of, finding out things that were going on. Well, actually, 70 years ago, his first official film came out in 1947. That's remarkable because it still feels like a very modern film in a way. So he's been working against all odds and against financial problems and just made some extremely beautiful films. And most all of them contain some kind of input from the Aleister Crowley corpus, either blatantly in visuals or symbolically through integration of other things, but they contain a particular kind of magical charge, a magical atmosphere, and it is fascinating to see these old films still hold sway. They still catch your attention and they won't let go.
As a purveyor of American culture for so long, Carl, looking from, Sweden over here, what is the fascination with this culture here, and why has our culture bred so many characters like Anton LaVey and Kenneth Anger and so forth?
Yeah. That's a very, very good question. And I don't think there's one, like standard answer that would sum up everything. I think it has to do with the fact that the American culture is very strong and it's very colorful. It has always merged with a culture, a pervasive culture of advertising. So there is this kind of intersection where personal expression looks for a form to express itself, and then it meets or takes part of this overall cult of strong colors and advertising, and also a philosophy of success that's been there since 19th century, and it's been quite different from a European mind frame. So I would say that specifically post World War II, this kind of thing sort of exploded or became like infused with some kind of steroid, almost technicolor steroids, and for people who wanted to stake their claim and be someone and be radical, it's kind of like a business approach. You have to have your own thing, and you have to be strong and visible and colorful. And if what you're saying is yourself and what you're creating, then it needs to be clearly communicated. So in the LaVeyan sense, I think that's one of the reasons why he used the symbol of Satan. And Anger hasn't really, marketed himself actively, but his films are still, very strong and very personal. So if I will have marketed him, it will have been with this thing that I have said many times already. It's like uncompromising vision and uncompromising, to express your innermost soul in a very, very attractive way. And I think, you could say that sort of sums up American culture in a way. It's loud and it's colorful, it's strong, and sometimes I would say most always fascinating. So I can't, it's a very good question. It keeps me thinking. But
would you say
it goes for literature too? It is like people talk about, Fitzgerald and Hemingway, and they stripped things down, and it's been such great culture coming from the U.S. And of course, what makes it great is that it comes from a culture that is very vital. It's usually a very vital energy around.
Sure.
That vitality can, of course, easily be corrupted, and I think we're seeing that right now. But culture has always been like a counterforce that takes on the good things and takes on the will to be successful, for instance, is of course that's not a bad thing. It's a very good thing. The will to succeed, the will to be successful. But when it becomes just mere corporate shell structures, that's a different thing than the entrepreneurial spirit. I think that's what I'm looking for. The entrepreneurial spirit is also permeating American culture. And I think that's what makes it special.
Yeah, so what I'm gathering is people such as you in Sweden. I would say you have a more conservative kind of culture there still to this day, where it's kind of stand in line. You can express yourself, but it's not rewarded or anything. It's kind of you stand in line, you get your career kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you do get rewarded, it's when you're as bland as possible.
Sure, and it's still like that.
Yeah, I would say so. I would say so. And of course, Europe in general is like, it's totally free. So the problem is not that people, they don't have to fight to succeed. So, complacent and comfortable.
Okay.
Whereas I think the American spirit is always that you have to fight for something. And I think in terms of creativity, I think that's a very good thing. The incentive should be that, I can do it. Not that, I need this grant from this institution, because that's just complacent.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Carl, because I grew up in, Southern California, and it's one of the most competitive places in all the world. And when you get into the, whether it's the social scene, you have all the most beautiful people of all different races and everything here competing for the girl or whatever, or you're a punk rock band. All the best punk rock bands were coming out of here at one time. And, I was involved in that scene. And now I'm involved in business. I run my own business, and it's highly competitive. You have to fight for everything. And I remember literally my first day of preschool, I fought someone. My first day of I guess in junior high, guess what? I got a knife pulled on me by a Mexican gang member at school. So that was how I grew up. And I walked 3 miles through the ghetto through school. From the white neighborhood to my school, and I got jumped several times, and that was kind of how I grew up. So it was always that fighting thing, and I've always kind of been a little bit more aggressive because of that. And it's actually gotten me in trouble, but it's also caused me to do things that most people wouldn't do and succeed and take risks and so forth.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's interesting to kind of get your side of that, Carl, I've always said that we're all magicians since we're ruled by magic. How do you feel by my statement? Is it accurate or not? And please elaborate.
Yeah, I think so. Unfortunately, I think also that most people live with a kind of an existential cloud or piece of existential textile over their heads and bodies, where they're simply not allowing themselves to look behind the veil, behind that piece of textile, and seeing life in its full glory and 20/20 vision and correct color grading, so to speak. When you have the veil, it's sharp. There are things that appear to be like different things. They're something completely different. So I think that magic is absolutely all permeating. We live in magic, and as many people have said throughout the millennia, and I think maybe the Buddhist parable of the lotus flower, you have to peel lotus flowers leaves to get to the actual flower and to the core, is that our problem is not so much the capacity. The capacity to realize these things is there. It's just that we are so overwhelmed, but not just one veil, but like hundreds of veils, and you have to take them off. Basically, you have to do like an extra striptease to get to a clearer vision, and there's no ready-made path for that. Even though, again, cults and religions would like to say that they can offer that, they really can't. It's all on an individual level, even within a family or some closely knit community that share a language, that share a set of symbols. It will be different from person to person. So I think that to be able to relate to magic, you have to see the magic. And in order to do that, you have to, literally, but also symbolically open your eyes and not be overwhelmed by what you see, but just take it for what it is. It's a kind of a more genuine view of life. And I think people are like, okay, but what is he talking about? I think what I'm talking about is the fact that if you listen to many indigenous cultures, for instance, or wise people, or people who have had some kind of realization or epiphany, is that everything and everyone is interconnected, and you can never escape that. When you try to cut the ties from someone else or something else or from nature, then you will be suffering from it. I think it sounds like a simplification, but of course it's a very complex, hugely complex simplification. But the thing, the magic lies in realizing how we're all interconnected, and then you can also make magic when you know that that's a fact. You can manipulate these things for your own ends, or for do good for other people, or whatever you want to do.
Yeah, definitely, and it all comes from the will, from what the thoughts and what you create on the outside as well. And you could do good and you could do bad with that. And, some people do good and altruistic things, and some people do bad, and some people just kind of just get along and play the game that we're in.
Yeah.
So what's next for you, Carl? What's your plans? I know you have CineMagician that was just released, and then you had mentioned you're doing a new documentary on Anton LaVey.
Yeah, that's right. And also there are many other things happening. The LaVey film will be, I think I'll work on that over the summer, be allowed to take the time it takes to finish that. It's going to be a great film. Tomorrow, actually, a new album that I've made with Genesis Peorage comes out. So I'm excited about that. And then there are more book projects. I run a publishing company, and we just published my wife's new book called Rendering Unconscious, which is like an anthology of texts about analysis and politics, and it's just very interesting stuff. So it's like a little factory over here. We just churn out stuff, books and writing, and making movies, making music, and conferences, and I think that it's almost hard to talk about all these things because there's so much stuff going on. So I would recommend that people take a look at our websites, trapar.net, carlabrahamsson.com. My wife and I have a Patreon. Maybe it's best if I email you all these addresses.
And
so you can maybe post them.
Yeah, I'll definitely put them on the show page. So if people want to check those links out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because it's there's so many things that
you're involved with.
And that are also relevant for what you discussed. For instance, this sort of Californian punk scene. I mean, the most recent book before my wife's book came out was a photo book by Ruby Ray, the San Francisco photographer, basically chronicling the punk scene in San Francisco between 1976 and 82. And I mean, it's just fascinating stuff, and for me, highly magical stuff.
Sure, definitely. And are you supporting yourself through your works and your publications?
Yeah. It's getting to that point where it all adds up, and
Awesome.
that's what I meant when I said in the beginning. That would not have happened if I had stopped sort of halfway and said, "No, I'll get a solid job."
Yeah, if you if
Get a solid job.
shoot,
So
if you stopped being authentic and Carl,
yeah. No, I
you
mean
might.
it's not inauthentic to get a job.
No.
I don't think that's. But I think that I've been so determined that I couldn't have cared less. And that in a way, when you're young, it's charming. When you're slightly older, it's irresponsible. But somehow it's worked out, and now everything is moving along, and I have I'm optimistic, always too optimistic, but at the same time, you can get by on momentum alone often, and I think that's one key to this strange little operation here.
Yeah, and Carl, just leave that momentum, right? So, in studying you, Carl, you put out a tremendous amount of work. You do a tremendous amount of podcast. You were extremely patient with me. You're very cool. You're a great dude, and I consider you to be a Gnostic of today, even though
Oh,
you know.
absolutely. Thank you. I
Well,
totally, accept that, I'm totally in favor of that. And the Gnostics were so interesting, but that's like another topic altogether. But yeah, I'm great at assignment.
awesome. Hey, Carl, thank you again. I would love to talk to you in another 3 to 6 months. Are you coming to the U.S. anytime soon, or?
Um, Not that I know of right now, but usually yes. That happens often because of many different reasons. But right now we don't have anything planned. We're doing a lot of things in Europe over the summer. But we'll keep you posted for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, let's keep in touch, and I would love to, if you come to the States, to come meet you and do a in-person
Okay.
interview.
Of course, of
Okay,
course.
awesome, Carl. Thank you so much for your time. I wish you
Thank
the
you.
best with everything that you do. You're welcome.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks. Talk to you
Okay.
soon.
All
Bye-bye.
right, take care.
Bye.
Bye, Carl.
Bye.